This is CTV News Channel. I'm Matt Scooby. Another escalation in the trade dispute between China and Canada today. This morning, China announcing a preliminary anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola imports.
China has announced a preliminary duty on Canadian canola imports. The provisional rate of 75.8% will come into effect on Thursday.
Imagine waking up one morning to find that nearly 3/4 of your most valuable export has just been shut out of its biggest market. Contracts vanish overnight, prices crash instantly, and entire communities built on that crop are suddenly staring at collapse. That's exactly what happened when China shocked the world by slapping a 75.8% tariff on Canadian canola. For many, it looked like the end of the road for one of Canada's most important industries. But here's the twist. What should have been a crushing defeat turned into one of the most surprising victories in Canadian trade history. Because this story isn't just about farming. It's about power, politics, and how a nation under pressure managed to turn disaster into opportunity. For Canadian farmers, the shock wasn't only a crisis, it was a test of resilience, strategy, and survival. What unfolded wasn't just a trade dispute, but a pivotal moment for the future of Canadian agriculture. The real question was whether this would be remembered as the moment Canadian farming collapsed, or as the turning point where crisis became opportunity. Canola is not an ordinary crop. For Canada, it represents much more than endless fields of golden flowers stretching across the prairies. Canola has become an economic cornerstone, generating close to $12 billion each year and supporting the daily lives of thousands of farming families. Rural communities thrive on its success, and it plays a role far greater than its appearance on grocery shelves might suggest. To an outsider, canola may seem like just another crop among many, but in reality, it has become an engine of influence, giving Canada leverage in global agricultural markets. That's why a disruption in canola exports strikes so sharply. These numbers aren't just abstract figures. They measure stability, trust, and Canada's position within a global system of supply and demand. So, when China announced a nearly 76% anti-dumping tariff on Canadian canola, the blow was immediate and severe. It targeted one of Canada's most valuable exports, undermined billions in trade, and struck directly at the heart of farming communities. On the surface, it looked like punishment, a direct attempt to weaken a vital Canadian industry. But beneath the surface, it was something far bigger than canola. It was politics wrapped in economics. The backdrop lies in Canada's decision a year earlier to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, aligning Ottawa with its Western allies in a strategy to counter Beijing's growing influence in global trade. China's move against canola, framed as an anti-dumping measure, was not simply about technical policy. It was a calculated signal. Beijing claimed that Canadian subsidies distorted markets and pushed down global prices, harming Chinese farmers. Canada rejected this claim, insisting its programs were the same stabilization tools used by most countries, not schemes to dump cheap goods abroad. At its heart, this wasn't a technical dispute. It was about power, influence, and leverage in an increasingly tense economic rivalry. The numbers tell the weight of the clash. In 2024 alone, China imported nearly $5 billion worth of Canadian canola, making it Canada's second-largest buyer. Overnight, that door slammed shut. The tariff depressed global canola prices, cut into farm revenues, and forced processors and exporters to scramble for new buyers. For farmers, the timing could not have been worse. Harvest cycles were already locked in, contracts were disrupted, and what had once been a reliable market was suddenly out of reach. Yet despite the severity of the blow, Canada's agricultural system showed why it has long been admired for its resilience. Decades of navigating difficult trade environments built a network of infrastructure and logistics designed to absorb shocks. This time would be no different. New markets in Asia, Europe, and even North America offered cushions against the loss. And investment in higher-value canola products offered another way forward. The disruption was painful, but it was also an opening, an opportunity to diversify, innovate, and reinforce Canada's role in global food security. Meanwhile, China was not insulated from the consequences of its own move. By raising the cost of Canadian imports, Beijing exposed its own consumers and industries to higher prices. Canola oil, animal feed, and related products became more expensive inside China. What officials presented as a protective measure carried serious risks of inefficiency, bottlenecks, and even domestic inflation. These ripple effects highlighted how fragile and dangerous blunt trade barriers can be in a world as interconnected as ours. Back in Ottawa, pressure was mounting. The Agriculture Minister and the International Trade Minister immediately scheduled urgent meetings with the Canola Council of Canada and the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Industry leaders warned that a 76% tariff was not just restrictive, it effectively closed the door to a $5 billion market. Political debate was heating up as well. Conservative Member of Parliament Michelle Rempel-Garner stood before reporters condemning the tariffs as a devastating blow to Western Canada's economy. She argued the crisis could have been avoided and demanded immediate government action. Her frustration echoed across farming regions where communities depended on canola as their backbone. China's probe into Canadian canola, which began nearly a year earlier, was directly tied to Ottawa's tariffs on Chinese EVs. That link underscored the bigger picture. This conflict was not confined to the fields of Saskatchewan and Alberta. It was part of a shifting global architecture where agriculture, technology, and politics collide. The accusation of dumping, at its core, struck at the question of fairness in global trade. Canada denied it outright, insisting its policies were transparent and consistent with international standards. But the outcome of this clash wouldn't be determined in courtrooms. It would be measured in the survival strategies forged by Canadian farmers on the ground. The key question was no longer whether the industry could survive the shock, but how it would adapt. Short-term pain was unavoidable, but the long-term trajectory would depend on choices made now. By leaning on Canada's global reputation for high-quality production, forging new partnerships, and moving up the value chain through innovation, the crisis could transform from vulnerability into resilience. Rather than the collapse of a market, this could be remembered as the moment Canada recalibrated its agricultural strategy for a new world order. Canada's response became a powerful demonstration of strategy and action. Farmers feared collapse, exporters braced for losses, and policymakers faced one of the most serious blows to agriculture in years. But instead of succumbing, Canada moved with purpose. Ottawa rolled out support programs, price insurance, reserve funds, and income stabilizers to shield farmers from the sharpest losses. These moves reassured communities across the prairies that they wouldn't be left to face the challenge alone. The message was clear: farmers would be protected, production would continue, and the industry would move forward. At the same time, Canada's private sector proved its adaptability. Farmer organizations, exporters, and industry associations pivoted toward new markets. What seemed like a devastating loss of access to China quickly became an opportunity to expand elsewhere. Within a single quarter, exports to the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia surged by 20 to 30%. These numbers prove that Canadian agriculture doesn't wait for closed doors to reopen. It builds new ones. Even more significant was the recognition that long-term survival couldn't rely on volume alone. Canada doubled down on processing technologies that transformed canola from raw seed into high-value products, refined vegetable oils, bio-based ingredients, and renewable energy applications. An industry leader put it simply: higher value products mean stronger competitiveness and more influence in global markets. By upgrading output, Canada turned canola into a suite of strategic goods. This was not about short-term revenue. It was about reshaping bargaining power. Economic analysts noted that this diversification reflected a sophisticated understanding of modern trade. Over-reliance on a single market always brings instability, but spreading exports across multiple destinations dramatically reduces that risk. Now, with trade expanding in Europe, Asia, and beyond, Canadian producers built a more balanced portfolio. Price swings in one region carried less weight, and Canadian negotiators gained new leverage, knowing their products were in demand worldwide. The deliberate push into processing reshaped Canada's agricultural identity. Canola was no longer just an oilseed grown on the prairies. It became a resource for advanced food production, renewable energy, and global supply chains. By linking farming with innovation, Canada placed itself among the countries that treat agriculture not as a vulnerable sector, but as a strategic engine of growth. This adaptability set a benchmark for mid-sized economies in a world of tariffs, protectionism, and shifting alliances. The lesson was clear. The real advantage lies not only in the scale of exports, but in the ability to pivot, seize opportunities, and turn challenges into leverage. Canada showed how to do it, turning what could have been a crushing blow into long-term resilience. The canola industry, once seen as a traditional farming pillar, now stands as an example of global integration, innovation, and strategy. The immediate crisis may have been triggered by a tariff, but the deeper story is about resilience. Global trade volatility can close a market in an instant, but those who are prepared, flexible, and forward-looking can turn volatility into momentum. Canadian farmers are proving that adaptability, innovation, and strategy are more decisive than any single foreign policy. This transformation of the canola sector isn't temporary. It's a lasting shift towards stability, competitiveness, and global influence. In trade, those who turn disruption into opportunity shape the future, and Canada is showing how it's done. The shock of a closed market revealed more than volatility. It revealed how foresight and resilience can transform disruption into momentum. Canada's canola industry is becoming stronger, more innovative, and far more influential than before. But as one battle ends, another may soon begin. The question remains, can this model of adaptability keep Canada ahead in a world where politics and economics collide with every harvest? What happens next will not only define the future of Canadian agriculture, but also shape the balance of power in global trade. One thing is certain, Canada has proven that when faced with crisis, it does not retreat. It adapts, it diversifies, and it turns obstacles into strength. That's all for today's deep dive into how Canada turned a 75.8% tariff into an unlikely victory. Stay tuned, because the next trade battle is already brewing, and the stakes are only getting higher. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.